I'm going to start by the solidarity campaigns with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And so I'm going to start by looking at what exactly we should be resisting in Palestine. And this is taken from a book that they released in '69 called A Strategy for the Liberation of Palestine. So resistance to Israel as a political, military and economic entity which is inherently racist and through its policies and actions denies Palestinians their land, their freedom and their rights is not terrorism. Resistance to Zionism, as you've heard from Paul, as a racist religious movement that uses the Israeli state to advance its true agenda, expansionist colonisation to create a Jewish homeland in the ancient kingdoms of Samaria and Judea, or modern-day Palestine, with no regard for the indigenous population, is not terrorism. Resistance to imperialism that tore up the carcass of the Ottoman Empire, distributed the land among the imperialist powers via League of Nations mandates, and seeks to control and influence access to strategic resources in the Middle East, is not terrorism. And finally, resistance to Arab reactionary regimes which defend and protect colonial and capitalist interests in the Middle East, and strike at any mass movement which seeks to free the economy from exploitative capitalist influence, is not terrorism. So the two-state solution being proposed, and we see it proposed in the media constantly, would leave the racist Israeli settler state in place, while failing to recognise the inherent links between the state and the Zionist movement. The proposal would confine Palestinians to less than 20% of the land mandated by the British in '47, and would leave the situation of the Palestinians driven from their land in what is now Israel unresolved. It attempts to legitimise the situation in the West Bank with the alienated enclaves, divided by checkpoints, barriers, the annexation wall and a brutal military occupation. And it also denies that the Gaza Strip has become the largest concentration camp in the world, which isn't surprising with 50% of the people made up of refugees from the Nakba anyway. This is what represents the proposed Palestinian state. Not only that, but it represents the best that Palestinians can hope for. Resistance to all of this is not terrorism. So in August 2005, Israel withdrew its occupying forces from Gaza with great fanfare. They'd been present since '67 and dismantled all Israeli settlements. There were approximately 9,000 settlers. While the Israeli state no longer occupied Gaza, it controlled the airspace, surrounding waters and all border crossings, so essentially 1.5 million Palestinians were now trapped in a massive refugee camp. The lack of any real advancement for Palestinian liberation by the ruling party Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat, meant in January 2006, Hamas won 76 of 132 parliamentary seats in the Palestinian parliamentary elections, giving them a clear majority over the incumbent Fatah party. This is described not so much, and we would hope not so much, as a vote for Islamist fundamentalism, but instead against the complicity of the current ruling regime, the current ruling corrupt regime in the West Bank, and any lack of progress for the Palestinians under the US-led peace process. In June 2007, Hamas took control of the Gaza Strip after civil war with Fatah, and this prompted Israel to impose an economic blockade, which the UN has called a human dignity crisis. What does this economic blockade mean, or what did it mean to the Palestinians? The blockade limited fuel imports, including petrol, diesel, power plant, oil and cooking gas. This meant that Gaza's sole power plant operated intermittently, causing Palestinians to be without power for up to 16 hours a day within the Gaza city. The lack of fuel also affected the ability to treat raw sewage. Gaza's sewage body estimated that 50 to 70 million litres of raw or poorly treated sewage was dumped into the ocean on a daily basis. That's daily, due to a lack of fuel and Israel not allowing fuel in. This caused significant damage, obviously, to the environment and marine life. Water pumping stations are also affected as they run with fuel. So in May 2008, 15% of people had access to water 4 to 6 hours a week. 25% had it every 4 days, and 60% had it every other day. By December 2008, people could expect to get access to water once a week for only a few short hours. The Israeli regime, as part of the blockade, also imposes strict controls on the borders. Under the tyranny, items not deemed critical by the Zionist state or of a humanitarian nature, humanitarian within the context of this is quite funny, they are prevented from entering Gaza. This has caused Gaza's economy to completely collapse. Unemployment rates by December 2008 had risen to 50%. 50% of the population didn't have a job. Before the siege, up to 750 trucks of furniture, food products, textiles and agricultural produce left Gaza every month, and that was worth $500,000 a day to the economy. What happened under the economic blockade is that no exports were allowed. By December 2007, 75,000 of Gaza's 110,000 private sector workers had been laid off. 23 of its 3,900 factories and industrial enterprises remained open and functional, and some of those 23 out of 3,900 were only partially functional. Approximately 40,000 permanent and temporary jobs were lost in the fishing and agricultural sectors, part of that due to the raw sewage being dropped into the sea, part of it also because the IDF imposed restrictions on how far out Palestinians could fish off the Gaza coast. It was 12 nautical miles after the blockade. They brought it down to 6, and recently, since the ceasefire, they've brought it down to 3. I don't know how that correlates with a ceasefire. This siege and collective punishment of the people of Gaza continued until July 2008. A ceasefire agreement between Israel and Hamas was reached. The agreement required that Hamas would stop firing rockets and mortars into southern Israel. In return, Israel would lift the economic blockade, providing much needed relief for Gaza's 1.5 inhabitants. They would also promise to stop targeting Hamas with military operations in the Gaza Strip. So who broke the ceasefire? Condi Rice. The United States strongly condemns the repeated rocket and mortar attacks against Israel and holds Hamas responsible for breaking the ceasefire and for the renewal of violence in Gaza. The New York Times, Israel must defend itself and Hamas must bear responsibility for ending a 6-month ceasefire this month with a barrage of rocket attacks into Israeli territory. Both of those are completely wrong. In fact, the ceasefire was broken by Israel on November the 4th, 2008 when an airstrike killed 5 militants and a civilian in northern Gaza near the border with Egypt. That's not the most important thing. The most important thing for me was that part of that ceasefire was that Israel was going to ease the economic blockade, thus giving Gazans a chance to live normal lives. So from July until November 2008, when the ceasefire was broken, Israel continued to only allow humanitarian aid through the border crossings. Right, so the top one's the Karni border crossing. This is the one, obviously, where imports go out, truckloads come in. The red line is the exports. So you'll see that after Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, exports completely stopped. This is stuff you just don't see it around. And you'll also see the imports, so what they actually are allowed to live on, and you see the drop after the Hamas takeover. The bottom one is a UN graph. This is where the Hamas takeover was. So the easing of the economic blockade, or the media saying that the economic blockade was eased, as you can see, is complete rubbish. We're also led to believe by the media, and most people just swallow this stuff up, that Hamas rocket attacks into southern Israel continued unabated during the 5.5-month ceasefire with Israel. Now, obviously the facts have a pretty different narrative. One needs to go no further than the Zionist state's own Ministry of Foreign Affairs to rebut this argument. They've got the data on their website, and there it is. So you'll see that here's the ceasefire. Now, the ceasefire was with Hamas, so there were still some groups, obviously, who felt it necessary to fire some rockets into southern Israel, but you'll notice the massive difference under the ceasefire, and obviously this is when Israel broke the ceasefire. So while rocket attacks targeting civilians should be condemned, they also need to be represented within a context of war. This is to say that the Palestinian resistance is currently at war with an occupying army. So the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine explains what the rockets represent to the Palestinian people. The rockets are both a practical and symbolic representation of our resistance to the occupier. They are a constant reminder that the occupier is in fact an occupier, and no matter how they may engage in sieges, massacres, fence us in, deny us basic human needs of life, we will continue to resist, and we will continue to hold fast to our fundamental rights and not allow them to be destroyed.